Okay, full disclosure, you might hear my roommates in the back. Nothing I can do about that. But I will do my best for our discussion. So, the first question I chose was, do you think Michelle Carter's biological sex or gender affected how the public perceived her behavior? Do you think being a 17-year-old girl helped or hurt her when people heard about this case? Were race, social class, or sexual orientation factors in this case? Okay, long question. So I'll break it down between gender, age, and then race and social class. So first, her gender likely influenced her how the public perceived her behavior. As a young woman, I feel like there are societal expectations around being nurturing and emotionally caring, and it just sharply contrasts um the actions that she's accused of encouraging her boyfriend to kill himself. So her gender, I think, is amplified as a part of the shock of this case, and just as women are often stereotyped as less capable uh, less capable of encouraging violence or harm, makes the shock factor higher. And then her age, her being a 17-year-old girl, is pretty young considering. So I think it could have gone one or two ways, because I think you could either look at it and say, oh, she's a 17-year-old teenager, she's immature, easily susceptible to poor decision making. But on the other hand, you could look at her and say, that her age led her to perceive her actions as manipulative or cold-hearted, with more intent. Either you see it as immature, or you see the manipulation side of it. And it just increases more shock factor, given that teenage girls embody innocence and compassion. And then the last part of this question, race and social class, I think they also definitely played a part, with her being a white middle class female. She may be perceived differently by both the public and the justice system, like the courts and stuff. Public sympathy might have been the most influence, just when people hear about this case and be like, oh, she's a middle class white woman, legally she's gonna be okay. Or courts wise, we do tend to see females not get as much harsh treatment, so she could also maybe possibly not get harsh treatment based on her race and social class. Not saying that it did happen, just saying that it's a possibility. Okay, and then the next question, should encouraging someone to commit suicide be a crime throughout the country? What are the arguments for and against this? Okay, so for argument for criminalizing encouraging suicide, I think encouraging suicide can be seen as a form of psychological manipulation and coercion. And the consequences are just devastating. So, recognizing it as a crime might act as a deterrent and reinforce the societal value of protecting human life. And it also might just hold individuals accountable and ensure justice for victims and the victims' families. And then the arguments I have for against criminalizing it, is that criminalizing such behavior could lead to debates around free speech, like our constitutional rights, and even like the intent around it, like maybe she was joking. Like, can we legally hold someone responsible when we don't know the intent, like something in a text? And then there's also the mental health issues that underlie in like this cases that they used her drugs, saying like she was less responsible, so maybe we just can't criminalize it because it's not such a clear-cut answer. And then for my next question, I did, what if someone verbally encourages another person to commit a crime? Should the person who encouraged the behavior be held criminally responsible in part? Consider the following crimes. I won't read them off because I will go into them. So, first, I just think as a general principle, encouraging someone to commit a crime can create a shared culpability. The degree of responsibility might vary depending on the crime, the intent, the relationship between the encourager and the perpetrator, and like the outcome of the crime. So I'll get into each one that was listed. The first one was burglary. So I think encouraging someone to like break into a property can make the encourager partially responsible for the theft or damage. And then robbery, suggesting or planning a robbery of someone could definitely lead to charges of accessory or conspirator. And then both assault and sexual assault, inciting violence at a heated moment, or pressuring or encouraging an assault through words could warrant legal responsibility and culpability. And then the final one, homicide. We already have a lot of rules in place for this one, that provoking someone to commit murder with intent or planning can lead to charges of conspiracy or aiding and abetting. So, luckily that one we already have a bunch of rules for, but I do think we easily could criminalize it for other crimes. Okay, and then the last of the first set of four is, why do you think Michelle Carter opted to have her trial before a judge instead of a jury? Okay, purely strategic on the lawyers. I do think this was smart of them because opting for a bench trial suggests her defense team believed a judge might analyze her case more like objectively and resist emotional bias, because juries could have been more swayed by the sensational aspects of the case, and like because of her gender, age, and mostly those text messages. The text messages are a big like shock factor. They're a very emotional through like the lens of a juror, that it's a very emotional thing. So I think just having a judge analyze it makes it able to separate the emotions and the all the legal things behind it. So I think it did also work in her favor. I think it was better for her that she chose the bench trial. Okay, and then next set of four questions. Okay. When a woman commits homicide, their victim is rarely another woman. Why do you think this is true? Okay, why women rarely kill other women, I think, is because gender, like, often emphasizes women's roles as caregivers. So even with a woman who we can just jump to homicide and say she's a murderer, even a violent woman will still see other women as caregivers. So hopefully that's the reason it leads to lower rates of violence against other women. But I also know other reasons are that homicides committed by women tend to occur with intimate partner relationships or in self defense rather than premeditated acts. So, premeditation is less common, but I did want to share kind of a little random of the best, like, example I have of woman against woman homicide is that I have just done personal research about cases where women will pretend to be pregnant and fake a pregnancy, either to get a boyfriend to stay, to get family support, or just to get attention. And then they will befriend another pregnant woman, usually a very young pregnant woman. And towards the end of the pregnancy, they will either plot or carry through with the plan to kill their friend, the pregnant woman, and steal the baby and claim it as their own. And I just think that's crazy that that's happened on multiple occasions. Not just one person that has thought of that. Which is pretty crazy. A little random, but an example for that. Okay, next question is, which is more common in the United States, homicide or suicide? Do you think both of these problems receive equal attention? Homicide is less common than suicide. Suicide is more common. However, homicide often receives more media attention because it involves harm to others and just is that shock factor. And suicides, I feel like, are treated as more private tragedies. Like, you don't want that all over the news. And I do think that they're both receive equal attention. They're both equally important for different reasons. So, my next question, what is the gender paradox of suicidal behavior? Explain why you think this paradox exists. Okay, so if you don't know, the gender paradox refers to the phenomenon where women attempt suicide more often, but men complete suicide at higher rates. So, the reasons for this paradox is that men tend to use more lethal methods like firearms, while women often choose less immediate fatal means. So, this is usually because gender norms discourage men from seeking help because it is seen as emasculine, and this leads to untreated mental health struggles that escalate and then complete as suicides, whereas women have more, not always, but usually have more interpersonal connections and do feel more comfortable with talking about their feelings, and so they have more attempts but less casualties. And then my last question, how can understanding gender help us understand gender differences in suicide attempts and completed suicides? So, the key insight on this is that gender helps explain differences in societal expectations with the masculinity, and then coping mechanisms between men and women, and just access to resources, but mostly more that women are gonna access those resources more than men are going to reach out. And then, like, kind of what I was trying to say before is that women may communicate distress and those feelings more openly and seek help, and men are just constrained by the societal norms of being masculine and emotional suppression, and may lack these outlets and therefore increase their likelihood of a fatal outcome. Okay, now that we're done with that, we're on to the deer question. So, what does deer mean by gender equity in traditional law, and what were pre-colonial responses to rape? How does the conversation of tribal rape law fit with our discussion of gender-based violence? Okay, let's break this down. Talking too much. Okay, Sarah Deer explains gender equity in traditional law as the balance and respect for women's roles in indigenous legal systems before colonization. So, where many tribal communities valued women as integral parts to governance and justice, because in pre colonial times, rape was viewed as a severe violation of community and harmony, and responses were centered on restoration and accountability rather than just punishment. So, meaning not just punishing offender, but providing resources to those women to help their lives get back to the way that they were. And these systems were sadly disrupted by colonialism, which imposed patriarchal legal frameworks that often ignored or minimized gendered violence. So, the conversation about tribal rape law aligns with discussions of gender based violence by highlighting how colonial systems perpetuate gender inequality and fail to protect indigenous women. And I just think it's crazy how we're talking like, oh, this is colonial times, but there was that example in the book that I believe was in the 60s about the men in Congress saying like rape punishments were lower for indigenous women because they weren't seen equal to the white woman. Crazy that was only that recent. But Deer emphasized the need to reclaim traditional indigenous practice to address rape and gender violence more effectively, showing the importance of restorative justice and survivor-centered approaches in combating issues rooted in gender inequality. So, I think the restorative justice and survivor-centered approaches with taking things back to the way that they were instead of just punishing the offender, that's important too. But the trying to help the survivors isn't important for just Native Americans, but also all victims of that violence would be good for everyone. And then the last question about the Canvas article: what is the legal loophole that prevents prosecutions on reservations? What are the intersections that come to play when discussing rape on reservations? Okay, so the legal loophole that prevents prosecutions on reservations stems from jurisdictional limitations imposed by federal law. I am just going to go into that. I don't know if I'm going to say it correctly. I hope I do, but with the 1978 Oliphant and Suquamish Indian Tribe Supreme Court decision, tribal courts are stripped of their authority to prosecute non-native individuals even when they commit crimes including rape on tribal land. I don't know why. I don't know why they would do that. Because this creates a significant gap in justice as non-native offenders, who often target native women because of these reasons, are they're subject to federal, because they're not subject to federal prosecution, because even though it is up to federal prosecution, since then reservations can't prosecute them, federal authorities frequently decline to pursue these cases, which is very sad. Just very sad because I just don't get why we have that law, because we can prosecute people outside of the US when they commit crimes here, prosecute immigrants or people just visiting the country, so I don't understand why that's a law. But when discussing rape on reservations, several intersecting factors come into play, including systematic racism, sexism, and the historical impacts of colonialism. That's where it all started. Native American women face disproportionately high rates of violence, often rooted in the colonial systems that devalued indigenous women and disrupted traditional justice mechanisms. Poverty, geographical isolation, and lack of resources on reservations further exacerbated the problem, making it difficult for survivors to access support and justice. Additionally, overlapping jurisdictions between tribal, state, and federal authorities create confusion and ineffective um ineffectiveness. Sorry, read my notes wrong. Reinforcing barriers to prosecute offenders and protecting Native women. So, I also wanted to end on one more last crazy note that in the book she mentioned that although Europeans would refer to the Native Americans as savages, but were shocked that they didn't rape their women. It's just crazy that they were shocked they didn't do that, when I would hope that everyone agrees with me that it is naturally seen that that's wrong, but that's just crazy that the opposite was the natural effect. So, lot of crazy topics, lot to go over. Ready to listen to everyone's responses.